Well, hello, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started and just hope that the other two panelists join us at some point. So I'm Takia Harper Shipman. I'm an assistant professor of Africana Studies at Davidson College, and I will be chairing the panel today. This is on international feminism, feminist thought, practice, and political subjectivity. So today, present with us, we have two panelists who will present for about 15 minutes, and then we will open up the discussion to those of us in the room, or the virtual room. So we will begin with Andra, and I will time and give you a 5-minute warning and then a 1-minute warning.
Sure, thank you so much. Now I've moved a whole bunch of stuff around. So let me make sure I find my presentation.
Do you need screen sharing?
No, I have sharing capability, but apparently when I jumped, I was messing around in a bunch of places, and you know how your slides like never show up in the right spot. So it wasn't at the top. So I should be there. Give me 1 minute.
No worries.
There we go. Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming to this panel. We really appreciate your being here. Today, I'm going to present archival data that happens to be housed at Emory's Rose Library. And I'm looking at the notion of biography and how biography can help to presage a politician's future political activities. And so I'm going to be using data from Barack Obama's college letters to his girlfriend to talk about his attitudes towards feminism and race and linked fate. So I want to start off with the quote from Maya Angelou that should be very familiar to some, that many people started to use during the 2016 campaign, where she said that when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. And so there is something to be said for looking at a person's character development and even the start of their worldview and career trajectory based on attitudes that they develop earlier in life, especially when they articulate them and put them to paper. So the larger question for this particular project is whether or not we can discern hints of Barack Obama's developing political worldview from his earlier writings. There is a connection of this paper to my most recent book project, which came out 2 years ago, called Race in the Obama Administration. And the research question there was, what did Obama really do for Blacks? I was entering into a discussion that others like Fred Harris and Michael Dawson had entered into before. Here's what I do that's different. I'm not going to go over everything that's in the paper, but over everything that's in the book, but I will provide sort of a larger overview of what I was doing in the book, because there are bridges between the end of that book and this particular project. So one of my methodological goals was to document the progress, regress, or stasis of Black life chances over the course of the Obama presidency, going back and just using data that was being publicly collected, about race and about racial inequality during the Obama presidency. I then go and do a deep dive into executive orders and press releases from various cabinet departments to examine the Obama administration's reported activity on race during his term in office. I try to make distinctions between substantive and symbolic activities. And then I end with public opinion to look at Black voters' responses to the Obama presidency, whether they approved of his job or not. So one of the big takeaways from the book is that I actually don't think that it's correct to say that the Obama administration did nothing on behalf of Blacks. You could argue that it could have done more, but to say that nothing happened, I think is actually not borne out by the data. Not everything worked. Not everything received sustained attention. Some of that may reflect Obama's larger deracialized campaign strategy, where he didn't actually highlight certain activities for fear of gaining negative attention. One of the things that we do learn from this is that Black elites and Black voters assess the Obama presidency differently. And if we look at public opinion for President Obama remained strong. And in the data set that I'm using, which admittedly had a small sample size, we were able to ask questions about whether or not people were satisfied with the trajectory of the Obama administration. By and large, African Americans were, but we even see nuance in terms of support. So within public opinion data, people were dissatisfied with or disappointed in what Obama accomplished racially were more likely to rank him lower or give him lower approval ratings. And so, sometimes that stratospheric approval rating that Obama enjoyed amongst African Americans throughout his presidency belied the fact that there were people who were giving pretty nuanced critiques of the administration. So here's the bridge to this particular project. In the epilogue of the book, I'm talking about the differences between Barack Obama and Donald Trump, and thinking about what this actually meant for the Trump presidency, and what this looks like, what the comparisons and what the contrasts would be. And one of the things that was really interesting was that I had access to the Obama papers right before the book went to press, so I could add this stuff in, and then I just wanted to build on it later. So I'm going to make connections between what Obama says in these papers versus what he says, versus what Donald Trump said in his first book, The Art of the Deal. And so in the first letter in the Obama letters, this is the start of Obama's senior year in college, he is talking about his favorite class. And so he's getting really excited about a general ed requirement for all intents and purposes. And you can see his intellectual curiosity. You can see his mind at work. You can see him making connections between what he's learning in physics class versus what he's learning in his government and his poli-sci major. When Donald Trump reflected on his time in college, particularly at the Wharton School, it is completely instrumental. And so he's like, well, if I have to go to college, I might as well go to the best. I am not going to get into what his niece said about how he got into the Wharton School, but he's like, yeah, okay, so I got in because I needed the credential, and I don't think that the people I went to school with were that smart, though they were at the best business school in the country. And so the Barack Obama of 1982 seems very much like the Barack Obama that we knew from 2009 to 2017, and the Donald Trump that we're reading about in 1987 seems very much like the same person who we know about today. So I think that there are interesting nuggets and kernels that we can get from archival data. So today I'm going to be talking about the archival data, which is the whole of the Alexandra McNear papers that are housed at Emory University. So Alexandra McNear was Obama's girlfriend when he was a student at Occidental College. They stayed together after he transferred to Columbia University. And so the letters that are housed at Emory are from September 1982 to April 1984. And so it covers the end of their relationship, and there are even letters after they break up. So here's the timeline that's relevant here, and I'm drawing a lot of this from Dreams from My Father, or Barack Obama's first memoir. So as I said, this starts at the fall of his senior year at Columbia. His father is going to die later that first semester. He graduates in spring of 1983. The summer visitation is important because there are letters that are being written during this period. And so after he graduates from college, he goes back home to visit people in Hawaii. He goes to visit Alex in Los Angeles. And then he also makes a sojourn to Indonesia, where his mother was still living. By the time we get to the September 1983 letter, it's very clear that Obama and McNear have broken up, because he kind of refers to the relationship in the past tense. And you can see the lead up to why this relationship falls as you read the letters. And then by November, he is working a temp job supervising file movers for the city of New York. By the spring of 1984, Obama has started his job working at Business International, which he documents in Dreams from My Father. And then 1987 is going to be that first trip to Kenya, where he meets his father's family for the first time. So there's some general observations that I want to talk about here to kind of set the stage for the archives. So the one thing that, is interesting is that if we look at the letters and we look at the cadence and the writing style, this is very, very similar to what we know the fully adult Barack Obama, the senator and president, writes. So I'm just going to sort of stop for a second and let you read. This is the first part of the letter that I excerpted on the earlier slide, where he's setting up the stage, and you can see kind of the rhetorical flourishes, and you can kind of hear his voice as he's writing this letter. I'm happy to go back if you haven't quite gotten through that first paragraph. Obama is writing as a 22-year-old. And because of that, he is still figuring a lot of things out. And he is very conscious of that and very self-aware of this. And so he talks about this. And so he's like, I play with words and pretty patterns. He talks about intellectual. So this one is really interesting. I usually wouldn't think about writing to my beloved talking about T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, or talking about Ezra Pound or Nietzsche, but he is totally doing this. And so you could see a really heady relationship here. And he could also see him trying to make sense of his education, trying to make sense of his place in the world. Because of this relationship seems very, very complicated. And so one of the interesting things in the letters is you see them arguing back and forth. So there are times where Obama is referencing tense phone calls between the two of them. If you look at the actual text, there's one letter in particular where Obama is writing things and Alex is writing things in the margins, where you see her reacting to what Obama is saying in the letters. And so in this particular letter from April of 1983, he sort of talks about an argument that they've had, and then he acknowledges that, he wasn't necessarily the most attentive or the most calming in this. And so he's trying to reassure her that their relationship is strong. They're going to be broken up by the end of the summer of that particular year. But in this discussion of these two young people trying to figure out who they are and where they belong in the world, we also see a burgeoning feminism. So in that same April 1983 letter, he is talking about Alex and whether or not she is going to meet her parents' expectations, or whether or not she is going to forge her own path. So I'll read here from the things that are in bold. He says, I don't want to wash over the difficulties you were having and their effect on me. I didn't want to offer a smiling, supportive attempt at eluding the problem. And on the phone, I felt that I had been too quick to brush off, like my grandfather, when my mother would get, quote unquote, women's problems and have to visit the doctor, and he would happily pay the bills, but no details, please. I wanted to fight the urge, which you yourself have noted in me, of adopting some sort of paternal posturing, coddling you and saying everything will be all right. Trust me. And so he is trying to act out this burgeoning feminism in terms of this relationship with this young woman, and trying to not embody the patriarchal posturing of the men who had been part of his life, his grandfather in particular. It's also manifest in a letter. So in one of the in the early letters in 1982, he's doing really interesting things. So at the end of the first letter, he writes out a poem for her. This is from Yeats, and then he asks you, "Who's the woman in you? That girl in the Midwest, the woman you may have been but never will be, a choice or a chance cast aside." And then he actually includes a review from the New York Times magazine, the New York Times, book review that was written by Anatoly Broyard, incidentally, of Rachel Brownstein's book, Becoming a Heroine. And so this is, I only know of one really heady relationship where people are actually like passing book reviews back and forth to one another. People usually are, writing your own poetry to each other. It's not necessarily good, but this relationship is super intellectual, but it's also centered around Alex becoming an independent woman. And then they keep it up. So in November of 1982, he's still trying to help Alex figure out who she is, because this is clearly something that is important to her. And he writes, "You say that you are 10 women, maybe more, in opposition to the oneness men have claimed. You speak truly. This cordoning off of individuals into compartments is something I fight every day. And in an attempt to extricate myself from the insidious grips of such conceptions." And so we see them both trying to figure out adulthood and figuring out something that is egalitarian and affirming of each other. This one is an interesting one. Conservatives have read into this text that perhaps Barack Obama is a latent bisexual. I'm going to read this one a little bit differently. He says here, in regard to homosexuality, I must say that I believe this is an attempt to remove oneself from the present, a refusal perhaps to perpetuate the endless force of early life. You see, I make love to men daily, but in the imagination. My mind is androgynous to a great extent. I hope to make it more so until I can think in terms of people, not women as opposed to men. But returning to the body, I see that I have been made a man, and physically in life, I choose to accept that contingency. I understand that accepting this as a woman in this society is dangerous. I want to know how you feel about this. Secondly, I disagree that the savoriness of cruelty is merely a myth woven into the fabric of male ideology. Again, I think it's something more basic that has asserted itself in the noxious form we see today. There is a reason why a Western man has been able to subjugate women and the dark races. And so what I see here is not an assertion of physical sexual preference, but what I see him trying to say is that he is learning to respect women as intellectual equals to men, and that he wants to engage on a cerebral level with women as equally as men, but he's acknowledging his physical heterosexuality at the same time. And he's also trying to say that just because he is physically a man, he doesn't necessarily have to adopt certain types of patriarchal stances as being somewhat innate or something that he can't help. We also see Obama developing his ideology and his identity, both personally and political, as a Black person. So we see race and class analysis. So in one letter in June of 1983, this is after he's graduated, he's gone home to Indonesia to visit them. And he talks about, how his mom and his sister are doing. It's like, my mother and sister are doing well, the former doing development work, focusing on women's industries and labor unions. But the struggling seems out of her, and the colonial residue of her lifestyle, the servants, the shopping at the American supermarket, the office politics of the international agencies, throw up continual contradictions to the professed aims of her work. And so that critique of his mother and how his mother was basking in her privilege as an American seemed to be really pointed, and perhaps not shocking of young people in relationship to their parents. But you also see him developing a sense of group consciousness and linked fate when he talks about that first job supervising workers, when they were moving documents for the NYFD. So he describes the workers, an odd assortment of lower income kids, elderly women, and unemployed liberal arts majors, struck me as some of the best people I've met. As the 12-hour shifts wore on, I watched much subtle, straightforward contact being made and greater political perception than I had expected. It strengthened me in some important way. When he gets to work at Business International, he noted the strong relationships that he was developing with the African-American office workers. He had a white collar position there, but he talked about the women who worked in administrative positions and the young Black men who would come through making deliveries. And he says that I've cultivated strong bonds with the Black women and their children in the company who work as librarians, receptionists, etc. The only Black men one sees are teenage messengers who ride up and down the elevators or zip by on bikes. And we see him developing this consciousness that he is an African-American, that he's African-American, and that he might be in a more privileged position, but it seems like he is identifying with African-Americans who are not in the same class stratum that he is. But we also see Obama developing as an ideological pragmatist. So in April of 1983, he and a friend attend a socialist scholars conference in New York. And he talks about what it looked like. And he also talked about how he completely disagreed with it and didn't actually think that it was practical. And he describes the proceedings as this sense of unreality. So he's open to these new ideas, but he rejects them as being wholly unpractical or impractical. And so we might seize what the future Obama looks like. So to draw things to a close, there are things that I see in these letters about Barack Obama that look very familiar to the person who, we read about in The Audacity of Hope, who, we can see in his presidential administration. So the boyfriend who was attempting to have that egalitarian relationship is the same one who signed the Lilly Ledbetter law as the first law of his administration. And he talks about in his new memoir, part of the reason why, one, he thought that the merits of the case were a slam dunk, even though the Supreme Court ruled otherwise. And so I think he saw this as a pretty easy lift, and, and the significance of signing this as his first piece of legislation, perhaps, is significant there. The boyfriend who was very much in his head, seems very much like the critique of Obama as being the professor in chief, sometimes as being kind of too detached and too analytical. The son who thought his mother was a colonialist, we see echoes of that in Obama's critique of American exceptionalism, which certainly garnered criticism from Republicans. And the student who balked at socialism. We see the moderate pragmatist that we knew during his term as president of the United States. And finally, if we look at the young man who has a complex view of race and privilege, what we see is a president who had linked fate, who delivered on some of the promises that he made as president, but didn't deliver on all of the policies that were designed to incrementally improve Black lives at best. So with that, I will end the discussion here, and I look forward to your comments and Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andra. It seems the others have not joined. So Felicity, you can feel free to take about 20 minutes.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So my paper is called Afro-Japanese Feminist Practice, and it's going to be exploring the degree to which Japanese women have adopted, disseminated, incorporated the thought of Black feminist political practice. And I'm going to begin with a quote from Ayumu Kaneko, who is a historian chronicling the history of Black studies in Japan as an academic discipline. And she presents us with a very interesting question, which is, what can Black history in Japan do for critical interventions in contemporary issues of Japanese politics, society, and culture? A new body of academic scholarship has recently been flourishing in examining the space where Japanese people engage with and adopt aspects of Afro-diasporic cultural and political practice. This interchange is particularly noticeable between Japanese people and Black American culture. Now, trans-Pacific engagement has been ongoing for decades between different generations of Japanese writers, artists, and political activists and their Black American contemporaries. However, scholarship highlighting the history and depth of this exchange is relatively recent. The earliest academic scholarship outlined the representations of Blackness in Japanese literature and visual mediums such as anime. John G. Russell, one of the first scholars to really look at the representation of Blackness in Japanese mediums, shows that much of this representation was problematic at best, with Japanese creators often leaning on the worst tropes of Black people, that they were hypersexualized, they exaggerated their physical proportions, and were often associated with violent activities. More recent scholarship in the mid-2000s began to look more deeply at the degree to which Black Americans and Japanese people drew on each other's political practices and cultural aesthetics, a practice that is coming to be defined in the academic world as Afro-Japanese cultural exchange. This new field of Afro-Japanese intellectual and cultural exchange varies widely, with scholars tracking the exchange of literary practices, political practices, fashion, and music trends. Yet despite the extraordinary disciplinary breadth of this field, there's been very little scholarship on the matter of Japanese people engaging with the works of Black women. Yuichiro Onishi and Fumiko Sakashita, in a 2019 collected volume called Trans-Pacific Correspondence, Dispatches from Japan's Black Studies, are some of the only scholars that have tracked part of the history of Japanese engagement with Black feminists. there has been little sustained study highlighting the way in which Japanese people have read, translated, disseminated, and in some cases incorporated the philosophical and political practices of Black women in general and Black feminists more specifically. This paper aims to be the first part of a published article that will look at the intellectual products of Japanese women who have incorporated the philosophies of Black feminism and womanism into their work. In this paper, I will be exploring three such women: Fujimoto Kazuko, Yoshida Ryuko, and Shikapu Mieko. Fujimoto, who currently lives in and attended university in the United States, has chronicled the experiences of Black women from the late 80s to the 90s. Writing in Japanese and published exclusively in Japan, Fujimoto translated a number of major literary works produced by Black American women. She was one of the lead translators of a 7-volume anthology collection published in 1981 and 1982. This collection includes the most famous writings of Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Mary Helen Washington, Entozaki Shange, Zora Neale Hurston, Michelle Wallace, and many others. This was the first widespread dissemination of Black women authors in Japan. And not only did Fujimoto lead the efforts to translate these women, but she brought other Japanese women writers into the project with her. And on top of this, trained them to both engage in close reading and write critical reflections of what they were reading. Fujimoto trained other women writers to reflect on their experiences reading Black women writers as they worked on the translation project. Why did Fujimoto do this? Because for Fujimoto, the translation project was a political project. Fujimoto had long ago recognized the ethical and moral demands embedded in Black women's prose, and she recognized the transformative power within the literature of Black women. In her ethnography of Black American women called Even the Blues Are Just Songs, Black Women's Manifesto, Fujimoto opens the book with a meeting she had with Tonikei Bambara. In this meeting, Fujimoto asks what Bambara meant by the term salt eaters, referring to Bambara's 1980 novel, The Salt Eaters. Of Bambara's response, Fujimoto writes, "Salt is the metaphor tying our bitter and painful experiences together, tying our souls together. Moreover, as salt has the capacity to heal wounds, a salt eater is also a person who can heal wounds." In Bambara's novel, salt acts as a kind of magic, neutralizing the poison in the soul that festered from the disgrace and humiliation of slavery. The power in Bambara's language, and in the language of other Black women that Fujimoto interviews in this book, struck Fujimoto with its capacity to transform the listener. At the time of publication in 1986, Fujimoto decries the degree to which people dismiss how women express themselves. She writes that Japanese women have been in search for the appropriate language to describe their experiences for some time. As a result of this constant dismissal, women were fumbling to develop a language capable of fully expressing their experience using patriarchal, male-centered forms of language. Yet, in the writings of Bambara, in her conversations with Black women, Fujimoto found a language that was highly developed and sophisticated, and that succeeded in fully transmitting Black women's experiences in Black women's language. This language that was fully comfortable in its femininity, in expressing emotional vulnerability and pain, in centering female sexuality, sensuality, and valorizing female friendships and romantic partnerships. That alone for Fujimoto would have been extraordinary. But what really struck Fujimoto was that the listener and the reader were emotionally impacted by witnessing this expression. Fujimoto writes, "I listened, I wrote on such cruel and painful topics. As I wrote, I was also changed." As she writes this, Fujimoto writes of the degree to which so many cultures and countries incite violence towards others and rely on inflicting violence on others. And Japan, of course, is no exception. She writes, "Our hearts are closed." And yet, Fujimoto was still changed by her exposure to Black women's expression of their pain. She was so moved by the stories that Black women had to tell, not simply because they trusted in her enough to expose their personal stories and vulnerabilities to her, but also because Fujimoto saw this powerful transformative element. Black women had already developed their language to such an extent that it could in some ways convert the listener and move them to fight against the violence that up till now they may not have perceived in their own societies. It is with a view to stirring a similar transformation in Japan's ethnic majority population that Fujimoto writes of these stories, the hope being that a Japanese reader can be moved by the vulnerability and pain on display in this history and open their heart to the violence Japanese society inflicts on its minority population and minority women. Yoshida Ryuko, living in Japan, is a photojournalist famous for chronicling a number of major events in Black American history for a Japanese audience. She lived in Harlem for 5 years, chronicling the Black is Beautiful movements and her own racial awakening in her novella-length photo essay, Harlem's Hot Days. She contributed to a Japanese essay collection titled Our Alice Walker, an essay collection devoted to writers interpreting the works of Alice Walker and detailing their personal relationship to her body of work. Yoshida, in her essay on Alice's appeal, fully lays out Alice Walker's womanist practice. Yoshida writes of the history of the civil rights movement and the women's liberation movement in neglecting the needs of Black women. Womanism was the language Walker used to create a space that focused on Black women, that rejected the white liberal feminism that dominated women's lib. Yoshida is explicit in highlighting how Walker's political practices could enrich Japanese understandings of their social movements and uses Walker to critique Japanese society. She makes clear that in Japan, the Yamato people, the ethnic majority in Japan, are equivalent to white people. Thus, the feminism practiced by ethnic majority Japanese women is no different to the white feminism that Walker showed to be so damaging to non-white women. Japan has its own history of violence and discrimination to reckon with, and Japanese women are called on to do their part to practice a form of feminism that does not continue to degrade minority Japanese women. Moreover, Yoshida makes an appeal to Walker's internationalism to get the Japanese readers to consider how they are viewed by their neighbors. She writes, "The Japanese are seen as economic animals by their neighbors in Southeast Asia, people who strive only for profit and consequently exploit other countries in their region to attain this profit." In a disappointing turn, Yoshida neglects to mention that womanism is explicitly pro-queer and embraces women loving women in platonic and romantic relationships. The embrace of sexual love between two women is made explicit in the first line of Walker's definition of womanism: a woman who loves other women sexually and or non-sexually. There is no way of misinterpreting Walker on this. As there's never been any explicit homophobia in Yoshida's writings, it is difficult to account for the clear erasure of queer love in her summary of womanism. If I were being ungenerous, I could speculate that this part of womanism made Yoshida uncomfortable. If I were being more generous, I could speculate that Yoshida was worried an emphasis on the embracing of same-sex relationships would turn off a large portion of Japanese readers and prevent them from appreciating what Walker had to offer. Whatever the reason, it is sad to see a diminishing of the full potential of womanism through this omission. Chikapu Mieko is an Ainu activist, famous for her role in pushing for the recognition and transmission of Ainu cultural heritage. The Ainu is an umbrella term for the multiple different indigenous communities that lived in the northernmost part of Japan, Hokkaido, and the Kurila and Sakhalin Islands that are north of Hokkaido. The Japanese colonized and dispossessed the Ainu of their land and cultural practices during a period of imperial expansion that began in the late 19th century. Chikapu has done extensive work on relearning and teaching the practices of Ainu cloth art that were essential to transmitting the spiritual history and philosophic practices of different Ainu communities. She has written extensively on her experiences of Japanese imperialist violence and the effect this has had on Ainu families and especially on Ainu women. Her essay on Walker is an incredibly nuanced and intimate reading of The Color Purple, in which Chikapu seems to find a kindred spirit in Walker. Chikapu's affinity with Walker is due to a connection that comes down to more than a mere sympathy of shared oppression. Chikapu understands and shares Walker's philosophy, a philosophy that all parts of the natural world have spirit and deserve respect, not merely the humans, and a philosophy that places a love for life at the center of fighting oppression, and believes that if oppression is truly to be undone, a desire to live a loving life is essential. Chikapu quotes the character Shug from The Color Purple. Shug is the glamorous, free-spirited, sexually confident woman who is often maligned as being a woman of dubious morals. Chikapu quotes Shug as saying that love is the call of love's spirit, that when you cut down a tree, it is as if blood were flowing down your arm. There is a God here, Chikapu writes. The God on display here is one that is framed by a profound appreciation for existence and all of existence. It is from here that Chikapu begins to introduce us to what is most powerful about The Color Purple, that it encapsulates the brilliance of life. This is also encapsulated in the character of Sophia, Chikapu tells us, who is essential to showing that to live is to fight for oneself, that despite extraordinary suffering, we do not, and we must not, lose the capacity for love. Chikapu writes, the act of sharing mental anguish, together with the act of continuing to live and cultivating love, nourishes people. It is this nourishing that gives us the strength to keep fighting. This is a similar conception to that of Fujimoto, the idea that sharing and being exposed to a particular kind of pain is a creative act. It binds together those who have shared similar sufferings, who may have come to believe they are alone in their suffering. But more importantly, it shows that a life lived with love is not incompatible to a life lived with pain. And indeed, the strength of nurturing self-love, transmitting that self-love to those around you, is an extraordinarily powerful act of resistance. This is what Walker speaks to in The Color Purple, and this is what fires up Chikapu. I want to fight for this love, she writes, and demands that other minorities in Japan and the ethnic majority in Japan join her in fighting for a loving life as set out by Alice Walker. Reading through Fujimoto, Yoshida, and Chikapu's work shows that Japanese women's engagement and dissemination of Black feminist literature was both varied and deeply enriching. While the interpretations offered were not always without their problems, each writer interprets Black women in creative ways and uses Black feminist political practice to critique and change the shape of Japan's social movements. I call this Afro-Japanese feminist practice not because I'm calling each individual a feminist. Chikapu does not call herself a feminist for the same reason that many Black women did not call themselves feminists, because of the association with a white Japanese liberal feminism that relied on racial and class subjugation. However, as these women are drawing on the works of women who explicitly make clear their alignment with Black feminism or womanism, I am labeling the political practice itself. The appropriation and combination of a Black feminist political practice with Japanese social movements creates a hybrid that I am calling Afro-Japanese feminist practice that should be widely acknowledged and widely celebrated. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Felicity, for that very informative presentation. So now we will take the remaining time to open it up to the audience for questions.
I guess I will just ask a brief question because I actually need to leave in a few minutes for a student meeting. And actually, it's both are really, really, inspiring. I really like it. I really like, and for Andrea. So basically, since Felicity is actually in my seminar, so I know that we have been emphasizing this idea of intersectionality in analysis, in conceptualization, and it seems like you are doing exactly that. Even though sometimes you say race and class, but I said, oh, gender as well. it was just like you are talking about a number of these structural dimensions that Obama has been very sensitive in tapping into. And certainly I was looking forward to, okay, what is the linkage? And you mentioned a little bit about, the maybe not that much of a direct linkage between the administrative policy or attempt to have the policy, but didn't get to be passed. So I would just wonder about the evidence of that kind of the strength of a linkage.
Well, one of the things that's actually really interesting is that you see Obama's latent feminism kind of coming out in terms of how he is a romantic partner, right? He's trying to be an equal romantic partner in the relationship. He doesn't talk about gender a whole lot when he's talking about himself later on. And so it's not that they're bifurcated, because I don't think that they're that way. I just think that, he's just talking about different aspects of his life in different letters. And so, I think some of the gender stuff comes forward when he's thinking about that one interpersonal relationship. With Alexandra McNear. I think the part where it comes in the administration, I think, in some ways, some people might argue it's not necessarily sufficient. And there are ways that he stumbles. So, I mean, we could talk about the stumble of the My Brother's Keeper initiative, which was focused on Black, Brown, and Indigenous boys, and the critique that he received from Kimberly Crenshaw and others that girls in these communities were, facing the same challenges. And so why the emphasis on the young men in these communities. At the same time, if you look at Department of Education press releases, there was a focus on trying to increase the number of underrepresented young women in STEM. And so this focus on sort of increasing women's participation in STEM was very conscious to make specific foci on young women of color to make sure that their numbers were necessarily increased. So so that the one that came to mind is as soon as you asked the question, do I think that the intersectional focus is actually pretty deep in Obama's administration? I can't, right off the top of my head, I don't think that there was as much as some people would want to see, but it wasn't completely absent.
Great. Okay, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe quickly for Felicity. So actually, because I'm an Asian American woman, I was just curious about, I thought the Japanese woman would sort of almost like their natural, that if you're looking for any kind of American woman for inspiration, they were looking for somebody such as Yuri Kochiyama, who is actually very close to Malcolm X and the civil rights activists. So I was thinking of whether, that's, if you want any extension, perhaps you can look at some of the Asian American women and the certain literature about that. And because I was just wondering, we all women of color, and then there are differences, but there are also a lot of similarity. And I'm just thinking out loud, actually, whether or not you have any plan.
Yes, it's interesting. I'm still unsure if I'm going to include the Asian Americans and how, because there is the usefulness of including the Asian Americans to keep adding to the history. Look, this Afro-Asian interaction takes place in different spaces, takes a lot of different forms. But then there is the context of Japan, which is that your people of color technically on the global stage, but in Japan, the ethnic majority are the ethnic majority. And so the relationship that you now have to, critical race work, to Black consciousness, can be emotionally dishonest if, you have Japanese women who have consistently drawn on Black feminist texts. There are some, and, the women that I've listed, as well as others, Zainichi Korean women who've been very critical of the move, because they're basically saying, hang on, you are very conveniently sidestepping what is the most powerful critique of Black feminism, which is that elite women in society are part of the problem. And you are allowing yourselves to connect to global white supremacy without actually thinking about your domestic context where you are at the top. And so that's why focusing on the Japanese women in Japan allows us to see a different, more complicated view of this relationship. But I think if I were to expand this, I would include the Asian American to actually highlight that further, to say that this is actually very different in different cultural and historical contexts.
I'm afraid I actually need to leave. I'm sorry. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
So I have a question for Andra that's related to what Felicity is doing. And as I hear Felicity's argument, part of it is that these connections are driven by a sense that literature can make a difference, that actually reading these texts can have a great effect on sort of revealing possibilities that could exist, cruelties that are present that you don't notice. Do you see that kind of effect? I mean, the quotes that you have of Obama, you see him referencing these pretty highbrow sort of authors. Do you see a connection in reading through those texts with regard to what he was reading and what he happened to be thinking? And then the second question I have is, that I know one of the things that Felicity is really interested in is conversion experiences. And Obama doesn't strike me as a guy who did a lot of, I mean, I'm thinking of the gay marriage question where what was the phrase? I'm evolving about this. But are there any sort of instances in which there is a sort of a kind of not a religious conversion experience, but a kind of wholesale, the light goes on and you say, oh my God, I didn't see this, and I didn't see the depth of this going in the papers that you have.
In part because those papers only cover a 2-year period in the 1980s. I mean, so I think there are going to be limitations to what I am able to find there. I do find it interesting to read about this relationship with Alexandra McNear and then think about what his relationship with Michelle Obama looks like. And, if there are any differences, and I think some of this is just borne out by age. Alex, is figuring out who she is. And so she comes across as really insecure, but he also comes across as sometimes a bit of a bad boyfriend. Who is too into his head to get things. And Michelle Obama talks about how she learned to deal with that, which was basically to make him responsible for handling stuff at home as opposed to trying to be Superwoman and take the load for everything. And so I think it takes perhaps a better matched partner, and also one who was older and a little bit more self-aware and willing to go get counseling to, come to these realizations, to push Obama to kind of, be a little bit more attentive and to be more equitable in terms of sharing household responsibilities when he was finally in that formal, more legal relationship. I don't have access to other papers in particular to talk about Obama's evolution on issues like same-sex marriage. I think that it is a plausible hypothesis that could be borne out in the literature, that perhaps he was always supportive of it, but his evolution was more driven by public opinion, saying that it was becoming more socially acceptable and therefore it was a less risky move to come out in favor of marriage equality, in 2012 and 13 than it was previous to that. So, and especially, if you think about sort of, when he does actually come out in favor of same-sex marriage, right? It's in the second term in office. So it's, he doesn't have anything to lose politically by that, if I'm recalling my dates correctly. So, it may be that he said that he evolved, but really he was just kind of keeping, his cards close to the chest because he didn't want to create a political backlash.
Wonderful. Anyone else have any other comments or questions?
I have a question for Felicity.
Sure.
Do you see things, you saw things that were sort of ignored or not dealt with, or were there things that were sort of, just to use a cliche, lost in translation, that just sort of, when you saw this, when you read these works, you go, well, there's just, it's just not there. And I don't know, did that experience ever happen?
Not with these women, no. Part of that is because I think like the Japanese publishing industry is very strong and that translations are actually superb. The people who worked on this, and I've read a lot of other translations of Baldwin and Ralph Ellison, like they are seriously good translations. And I think that helps a lot, that they have a very strong literary culture and they have a very strong critical literary culture, so that you've already got a lot of that training baked in to then dealing with Black American literature. Where I do see, separate to this, some things getting lost, because I'm writing a paper on Black Lives Matter Japan, and some people who are writing about Black Lives Matter in America who clearly don't know what they're talking about, because they will say, okay, this is, the next generation of, fight against racial terror. And they'll be like talking about, Martin Luther King said this and Angela Davis said that. And it's like, but is that what's going on? Is that the people who are organizing this? And I think I guess this is not really a lost in translation so much as the images of BLM that you have in Japan, the focus on the underground organizers, and the nature of the horizontal leadership means that you have to focus on a lot of different Black Lives Matter centers to actually really get a sense of how Black Lives Matter is working practically. And so, the Japanese activists understand this, and the queer activists and the feminist activists understand this, but the more, mainstream older generation professors, you can see that, okay, you haven't quite clocked what is special about this movement vis-a-vis the older civil rights movements. But I don't know that's so much a translation problem so much as what you have actually been exposed to in the media and your social media on the mechanics of this movement.
Good. Thank you.
Paige, if you don't mind my going back, I realized you asked the first part of the question about literature and sort
Yes.
of learning through literature, and I realized I hadn't answered that question, so I apologize. In my book, when I talk about the contrast between Trump and Obama, right, I'm trying to make a case that like education matters and that the liberal arts matters and that valuing those things matters. What I take from those two quotes that I juxtapose is that Trump only cared about credentialing, and he was being very instrumental in his approach to education. He really wasn't trying to learn anything. He needed like a certain certificate that would give him entree. He got it. And that was basically it, but there's no real clear evidence that he learned anything about it. In another paper that I'm looking at, I look at sort of how Trump talks about his college education, and he says he graduated at the top of his class at Wharton, and there's no evidence of that at all. And people didn't necessarily think that he was the worst student in the world. He was more interested in the real estate classes because that was relevant to sort of what he had immediately in front of him. And he spent time going home on the weekends to, cultivate his spot in the family business. But you don't get the idea that this man was intellectually curious at all. What you see in Obama's letters is somebody who is incredibly and very keenly intellectually curious, and somebody who is thinking about how what he's learning in the classroom applies to real life, and doing it in a way that would be intimidating to some people because of the names that he's dropping. But I mean, I look at that as sort of like your typical really bright student, right, who tries too hard and overcompensates by name dropping like everybody in letters. I just wouldn't expect that that's what you'd be doing in a letter to your significant other.
Right.
Actually, I want to add to that because that is something that one of the chapters in the Trans-Pacific Correspondences are all interviews of all of the scholars who've been active in the Black Studies space. And you do see that intellectual curiosity as well, because all of them were like, I didn't intend to be here. Here are all of the things that were going on that led me to start reading Black people. And, the advisors were really important in that. And it was, that curiousness and that drive, just like, oh, what's going on here? Oh, okay, some really interesting things that then politicize you even more.
I know that is Trump, he's a guy who is not curious about anything beyond what happens to be in front of him.
Right.
He's not very curious.
Right. And he told us that 30 years before
right.
he ran for president.
Right.
All we had to do was read this. It's right there.
Right. But that is, the presumption then of going back in this way, and I'm so interested, Felicity, once again, I'm apologizing. This focus on conversion. There are these moments in which people change in some kind of significant way, where they see things that they didn't see before. And the presumption of a kind of biography, Andra, that you have of going back that far almost presumes that, like that series 7 Up, where you see these 7-year-olds and you see these 14, 21, 28, and you go, well, there's just a lot that's held on at each. But the notion of conversion, sort of political conversion or moral conversion, it's like something has happened. And does the kind of biography that you are writing is it open to that sort of thing? Is that the interesting case, when that happens?
I'm personally open to it. My own religious commitments say, yeah, we believe big in conversion. It's a whole sort of but I don't see it here.
Yeah.
And so, and I think even in terms of personality and disposition, like even when people have conversions, whether it's a religious conversion or they change their mind about certain issues, sometimes there's still that essence of a person that can be pretty constant from a pretty early age. So, I don't rule it out, but I don't see any evidence of it. What I see is a lot of continuity between the, Obama in his early 20s and the Obama that is approaching 60 today.
Do you see him instrumentalizing what he does? Is he always looking to the future of what he wants to do, or are there moments in those early correspondence where you see him actually enjoying? Well, I guess he does. I guess even what you showed, you see him enjoying what he's doing at that point.
And he's figuring out how to get along. What's interesting is also the medium in which he's writing. So he writes on basically whatever he can get. So there are times when he's got like old letterhead from his old business and you see him like scratching things out, or it looked like he was getting ready to start writing something else and he's got to spare that sheet of paper in order to be able to write that. If he talks about, using a bad check, I think, to reserve in Dreams from My Father, to rent a typewriter so he can sit and type out interview letters. So you see him kind of being the struggling sort of, young person who is managing to get a job. One of the things that he was concerned about was definitely being meaningful. And making a mark on the world. So when after he graduates from college, he lives for a time with a friend who is, if I believe, is either from Southeast Asia or from the Middle East, who is getting a job, kind of is doing all the things that one is supposed to be doing, right? And he's questioning whether or not that's actually meaningful. So you see him wanting to do something to have a broad impact. Do I read in these letters that he had this grand scheme that was put together? Like, we hear about Stacey Abrams' vision board. I don't see any evidence of the vision board per se, even though I don't necessarily think it was far-fetched that there was some planning and forethought, particularly by the time Obama, is approaching his 40s and he's running for office.
Thank you.
We also have a question. Oh, go ahead.
I just see one in the chat from Kelly.
Okay, yep, that's what I was going to read. I can just read it out loud for everyone. Sure. How do you interrogate his relationship to Reverend Wright and the impact of Black liberation theology on his development?
So in the letters that I'm looking at here, that predates him coming to Chicago. And it predates him making a decision to become a Christian formally. So at this point, his worldview is pretty secular in its orientation. And so he really hasn't encountered Black liberation theology yet.
Any other thoughts or questions on this really informative presentation? Okay, if not, then I believe we can say thank you to our panelists for these wonderful presentations. It was a pleasure to listen and to be engaged with your work. I hope that everyone stays safe and enjoys the rest of the conference. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.